Robert Martinez adjusted his tie one more time as he walked across the college campus. The early morning sun cast long shadows between the brick buildings, and families were already gathering for the graduation ceremony. At 72 years old, Robert moved a bit slower than he used to, but his pride carried him forward with purpose. Today was the day his grandson Michael would graduate with honors from the state university. Robert remembered when Michael was just 5 years old, running around his backyard in San Antonio, asking endless questions about everything. Now, 23 years later, that curious little boy had grown into a young man with a degree in engineering and a bright future ahead of him. Robert's late wife Maria would have been so proud to see this day. She had always believed Michael would do something special with his life. The old man found his seat in the crowded auditorium among hundreds of other families. Parents, grandparents, siblings, and friends filled every available space. The excited chatter and camera clicks created a buzz of anticipation. Robert pulled out his phone to take pictures, still getting used to the technology that seemed to change every few months. As the ceremony began, Robert watched the graduates file in wearing their caps and gowns. He spotted Michael in the third row, looking confident and happy. The young man had worked 2 jobs while going to school, determined to graduate without burdening his family with debt. Robert admired that determination. It reminded him of his own younger days when hard work and perseverance were the only tools he had. The keynote speaker talked about following dreams and making a difference in the world. Robert only half listened, his attention focused on Michael. He thought about all the sacrifices the family had made to get to this moment. Michael's parents had worked extra shifts, Robert had helped with tuition when he could, and Michael himself had given up many social activities to focus on his studies. When they called Michael's name, Robert stood up and cheered louder than anyone else in his section. Several people turned to look at him, but he didn't care. This was his grandson, his pride and joy, walking across that stage to receive his diploma. The moment felt like a victory for the entire family, a symbol of what was possible in America when people worked hard and supported each other. After the ceremony, Robert made his way through the crowd to find Michael. Families were taking pictures everywhere, and the campus had turned into a giant celebration. He finally spotted his grandson near the engineering building, surrounded by friends and classmates. When Michael saw him approaching, his face lit up with a huge smile. They embraced, and Robert felt tears forming in his eyes. Michael thanked him for everything he had done to help him reach this moment. They talked about the future, about Michael's job interviews, and about how proud the whole family would be when they heard the news. It was one of those perfect moments that Robert knew he would remember for the rest of his life. As they walked toward the parking area, Robert noticed more activity than usual near the main campus building. There seemed to be some kind of special event happening, separate from the graduation ceremony. Security personnel were positioned around the area, and he could see what looked like military vehicles parked nearby. Michael mentioned that there was supposed to be some kind of military presentation happening on campus that day. Apparently, a group of Navy SEALs were visiting to talk to students about military careers and leadership. Robert found this interesting, as he had always respected the military, though he had never served himself due to a medical condition when he was young. They decided to walk over and see what was happening. Robert was curious about military life, and Michael thought it might be interesting to learn about different career paths, even though he already had job offers in the engineering field. As they approached the crowd gathered around the presentation area, Robert could see several men in military uniforms speaking to groups of students and families. The SEALs were impressive-looking men, clearly in excellent physical condition, and carrying themselves with a confidence that came from years of training and dangerous missions. They spoke about leadership, teamwork, and the importance of serving something greater than yourself. Robert found himself drawn into their stories of training and deployment around the world. One of the SEALs, who appeared to be the senior officer, was talking to a smaller group about the mental toughness required for special operations. He was a tall man with graying hair and intense eyes that seemed to take in everything around him. There was something about his presence that commanded respect without him having to say a word. As Robert and Michael listened to the presentation, the senior officer began talking about the bonds formed between military personnel during difficult times. He spoke about how shared hardships create friendships that last a lifetime, and how the military teaches you to rely on others while also taking responsibility for your own actions. Robert found himself nodding along with many of the officers' points. Although he had never been in the military, he understood the value of hard work, loyalty, and looking out for your fellow man. These were principles he had tried to live by throughout his life, and principles he had tried to pass on to his family. The presentation continued with stories about missions around the world and the training required to become a Navy SEAL. The officer talked about the physical and mental challenges, the long deployments away from family, and the satisfaction that came from serving your country in such an elite unit. As the formal presentation began to wind down, people started to disperse. Some students approached the SEALs with questions about recruitment and training. Family members took pictures with the military personnel. The atmosphere remained respectful but relaxed, with the SEALs happy to talk informally with anyone who was interested. Robert and Michael were preparing to leave when something unexpected happened. As Robert turned to walk away, his shirt sleeve rode up slightly, revealing part of a tattoo on his forearm. It was an old tattoo, faded with time, that he had gotten many years ago. Most people who saw it probably wouldn't think much of it. But this situation was different. The senior SEAL officer, who had been talking to another family, suddenly stopped mid-conversation. His eyes had caught sight of Robert's tattoo, and his entire demeanor changed. The casual, friendly expression on his face was replaced by something much more serious and focused. He excused himself from the conversation he was having and began walking directly toward Robert. Michael noticed the change immediately and wondered what was happening. Robert, unaware that his tattoo was visible, continued chatting with his grandson about the graduation ceremony and their plans for lunch. The approaching officer's footsteps seemed to quicken, and other people in the area began to notice that something was happening. The commander's eyes remained fixed on Robert's arm as he closed the distance between them. There was recognition in his expression, but also disbelief, as if he was seeing something that shouldn't be possible. The casual atmosphere of the post-graduation celebration was about to change dramatically, though Robert had no idea what was coming. Commander Jake Sullivan had seen that symbol before, but not in the way most people would expect. As he approached the older man with the faded tattoo, his mind raced back to a classified briefing he had received years ago about covert operations during the Cold War. The tattoo on Robert's arm wasn't just any design. It was the mark of a group that officially never existed. "Excuse me, sir," Commander Sullivan said as he reached Robert and Michael. His voice carried the authority of his rank, but there was also a note of uncertainty, as if he was trying to solve a puzzle. "I couldn't help but notice your tattoo. That's a very interesting design." Robert looked down at his arm, realizing that his sleeve had shifted to reveal the old ink. He quickly pulled his sleeve down, a reflexive action he had performed thousands of times over the decades. "Oh, that old thing. Just something from my youth. Nothing special." But Commander Sullivan's trained eye had already taken in every detail of the symbol. It was a stylized eagle clutching a specific arrangement of arrows and olive branches, surrounded by numbers and letters that would mean nothing to most people. To someone with his security clearance and knowledge of military history, however, it told a very different story. Michael sensed the tension but didn't understand what was happening. His grandfather had never talked much about his past, always saying he had worked various jobs when he was younger. The family knew he had grown up poor and worked hard to build a better life, but the details were always vague. Robert preferred to focus on the present and the future, not the past. "Sir, I need to ask you something, and I hope you'll understand why," the commander continued, his voice dropping lower so others couldn't overhear. "That symbol you're wearing, where did you get it?" Robert felt his heart rate increase. It had been over 40 years since anyone had recognized the tattoo for what it really was. He had hoped those days were behind him, buried in classified files, and forgotten by everyone except the few men who had shared those dangerous missions. Apparently, he was wrong. "Like I said, just something from when I was young and stupid," Robert replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Commander Sullivan had been trained to read people, and he could see that there was much more to this story than a simple youthful mistake. The commander looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then stepped closer. "Mr. Martinez." "Robert Martinez." "Mr. Martinez, I'm Commander Jake Sullivan, Navy SEALs. That tattoo represents something very specific, and if you have it for the reasons I think you do, then we need to talk. Privately, Michael looked back and forth between the two men, completely confused. Grandpa, what's he talking about? What's so special about a tattoo? Robert looked at his grandson, then back at the commander. He could see in Sullivan's eyes that the man knew exactly what the symbol meant. After all these years of keeping secrets, of living a quiet life in San Antonio, his past had suddenly caught up with him in the most unexpected way possible. Michael, why don't you go get the car and bring it around to the parking area, Robert said quietly. I need to speak with the commander for a few minutes. His grandson hesitated, clearly wanting to know what was happening, but something in his grandfather's tone told him not to argue. Michael nodded and walked away, though he kept looking back over his shoulder as he went. Once they were alone, Commander Sullivan's demeanor changed completely. The friendly, public-speaking persona disappeared, replaced by the serious, focused officer he was during classified operations. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to ask you directly, and I need you to understand that I wouldn't be asking if I didn't already know the answer. Were you part of Operation Nightfall? Robert felt like he had been punched in the stomach. Operation Nightfall was a name he hadn't heard spoken aloud in decades. It was a series of covert missions during the Cold War that had been so classified that even most military personnel didn't know they had happened. The men who participated were sworn to secrecy for life, their service records scrubbed clean, their very existence as special operatives erased from official history. I don't know what you're talking about, Robert said automatically, the response he had been trained to give if anyone ever asked questions about his past. Commander Sullivan nodded, understanding the denial. Mr. Martinez, I know you can't acknowledge anything directly, but I want you to know that some of us in the current special operations community are aware of what happened back then. We know about the sacrifices that were made, and we know that men like you never got the recognition you deserved. Robert stared at the younger man, trying to process what he was hearing. For 45 years, he had lived with the knowledge that his service to his country would never be acknowledged. He had carried out missions behind enemy lines, gathered intelligence that helped prevent conflicts, and risked his life countless times, all while maintaining the cover of being a regular civilian. The operation had been so secret that the men involved weren't even supposed to know each other's real names. They used code names and met in safe houses, carrying out assignments that came from the highest levels of government. When it was over, they were told to disappear back into civilian life and never speak of what they had done. How do you know about any of this? Robert asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Because 20 years ago, I was briefed on some of the Cold War operations that laid the groundwork for modern special operations techniques, Sullivan explained. Your unit's methods, your training protocols, your mission strategies, they became the foundation for how we operate today. You men were the pioneers. Robert felt emotions he had buried for decades starting to surface. He thought about his teammates, men he had trusted with his life, but had never been able to contact after the operation ended. He wondered how many of them were still alive, how many had carried these secrets to their graves, how many had struggled with the loneliness of never being able to share their true service with their families. The tattoo, Sullivan continued, was your unit's way of maintaining connection, wasn't it? A symbol that only you men would recognize, so you could identify each other if you ever met by chance in civilian life. Robert nodded slowly. It had been exactly that. In an operation where everything was compartmentalized and secret, the tattoo was their one violation of protocol. Each man had gotten the same symbol, in the same location, as a way of honoring their brotherhood and their shared sacrifice. They knew it was against regulations, but they also knew they might never see each other again once the operation ended. Mr. Martinez, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to hear it, Commander Sullivan said, his voice taking on an urgent tone. 3 months ago, we captured a high-value target in Eastern Europe. During his interrogation, he mentioned Operation Nightfall specifically. He claimed that there were still people alive who had been involved in missions that could compromise current operations. Robert felt a chill run down his spine. What are you saying? I'm saying that your past might not be as buried as you thought. And if that's true, then you and any other surviving members of your unit could be in danger. The graduation celebration continued around them, families taking pictures, and saying goodbyes, completely unaware of the serious conversation taking place just a few feet away. Robert looked toward the parking area where Michael was waiting with the car, his mind racing with implications he didn't want to consider. "Commander, I've been living a quiet life for 45 years. I'm a grandfather. I work part-time at a hardware store. Whatever happened back then, it's ancient history. Sir, with all due respect, there are people in this world who have very long memories. And if someone is specifically mentioning Operation Nightfall, then it means they're looking for something or someone from that time period." Robert felt the weight of decades of secrets pressing down on him. He had always known this day might come, but he had hoped it never would. He had built a life, raised a family, and tried to put the past behind him. Now, on what should have been one of the happiest days of his life, watching his grandson graduate, everything was threatening to unravel. Commander Sullivan reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. "Mr. Martinez, I need you to take this. If anything unusual happens, anything at all that makes you feel uncomfortable or concerned, you call this number immediately, day or night." Robert took the card, feeling its weight as if it contained all the secrets he had tried to leave behind. What kind of unusual things? People asking questions about your past, strangers watching your house, phone calls where no one speaks, anything that doesn't feel right. Your instincts kept you alive back then. Trust them now. As if summoned by the serious tone of their conversation, Michael appeared at Robert's side. He had grown impatient waiting by the car and had come back to see what was taking so long. "Grandpa, is everything okay? You look pale." Robert looked at his grandson, this bright young man who was just starting his life, and felt a protective instinct that was even stronger than what he had felt during his covert operations. He couldn't let his past endanger Michael or anyone else in his family. But he also couldn't ignore what Commander Sullivan was telling him. "Everything's fine, Michael." The commander was just sharing some interesting stories about military service. Commander Sullivan shook Robert's hand, the gesture conveying more meaning than any words could. "Mr. Martinez, it was an honor to meet you. Please remember what we discussed." As they walked back toward the car, Michael peppered his grandfather with questions about the conversation and the tattoo. Robert deflected as best he could, but he could see that his grandson was curious and concerned. The simple family celebration had suddenly become complicated in ways that Michael couldn't possibly understand. 3 days after the graduation ceremony, Robert Martinez sat in his small kitchen drinking his morning coffee and trying to convince himself that his conversation with Commander Sullivan had been just a coincidence. Maybe the officer was simply curious about an unusual tattoo, and Robert was reading too much into it. Maybe his past really was buried deep enough that it would never surface again. But his years of training in reading situations and trusting his instincts told him otherwise. Something felt different in his quiet neighborhood. Small things that most people wouldn't notice, but Robert had been trained to notice everything. A car that had been parked on his street for 2 days that he didn't recognize. A delivery truck that had driven past his house 3 times without stopping anywhere. Phone calls to his landline where no one spoke when he answered. Robert had lived in the same house in San Antonio for 30 years. He knew every neighbor, every routine, every pattern of daily life on his street. When things changed, he noticed. And things were definitely changing. His training from Operation Nightfall had taught him that when you notice one unusual thing, you start looking for others. When you find 2 unusual things, you prepare. When you find 3, you act. Robert was already at number 3 and counting. The morning newspaper was late, which might mean nothing to most people. But Robert remembered that intelligence operatives often used newspaper delivery routes to monitor targets. A late paper could mean someone was interfering with normal routines to see how people reacted. He walked to his front window and looked out at the street, keeping himself hidden behind the curtain. The unfamiliar car was still there, a dark blue sedan with tinted windows. As he watched, he saw the driver's side window roll down slightly, just enough for someone to take pictures or make observations. Robert stepped back from the window, his mind automatically shifting into the tactical thinking mode he hadn't used in decades. His phone rang, and he let it go to voicemail. When he checked the message, there was only breathing and then a hang-up. The same pattern he had been experiencing for 2 days now. Someone was testing to see if he was home, learning his patterns, gathering information about his daily routine. Robert went to his bedroom and opened the bottom drawer of his dresser. Buried under old t-shirts and socks was a small metal box he hadn't opened in 20 years. Inside were items from his past that he had kept despite orders to destroy everything. A fake passport with his cover identity from Operation Nightfall, encrypted contact information for other team members, and a loaded pistol that wasn't registered to his real name. He had told himself years ago that he was keeping these things as mementos, reminders of an important time in his life. But, deep down, he had always known that someday he might need them again. That day appeared to have arrived. The pistol felt heavier than he remembered, but familiar. Muscle memory kicked in as he checked the weapon and verified it was still functional. Some skills, once learned, never fade completely. Robert slipped the gun into his waistband and pulled his shirt over it, just like he had done hundreds of times during covert operations. He needed to think strategically about his situation. If someone was indeed watching him because of Operation Nightfall, then they were either trying to eliminate him as a potential threat, or they wanted information about the mission that only he and his surviving teammates could provide. Either possibility was dangerous not just for him, but for his family. Michael called around noon to check on his grandfather and thank him again for attending the graduation. Robert tried to keep the conversation normal, but he found himself giving his grandson advice that sounded more like warnings. Be careful driving at night. Pay attention to your surroundings when you're walking to your car. Don't talk to strangers who ask personal questions. Michael laughed it off, saying his grandfather was starting to sound paranoid. If only he knew how much training Robert had in paranoia, and how often that training had kept him alive. That afternoon, Robert decided he needed to take proactive steps. He called Commander Sullivan's number from a payphone outside a shopping center, using tradecraft he hadn't employed in decades. You never made sensitive calls from your home phone or cell phone because those could be monitored. Commander Sullivan, this is Robert Martinez. We met at the university graduation 3 days ago. There was a pause. Then, Sullivan's voice became more focused. Yes, sir. I remember. What can I do for you? You told me to call if anything unusual happened. Well, things are getting unusual. What kind of things? Robert described the surveillance indicators he had noticed, the pattern of phone calls, the changes in his neighborhood routine. As he spoke, he could hear Sullivan taking notes on the other end of the line. Mr. Martinez, where are you calling from? A payphone at the Westfield Shopping Center on Military Drive. Good. Old school tradecraft. Listen carefully. I want you to drive to the address I'm about to give you. Don't go home first. Don't stop anywhere else. Just drive directly there and wait for me. Can you do that? Robert wrote down the address. It was a small office building in a business district across town. Commander, what exactly is happening? Sir, we'll discuss it when I see you. But I will say this, your instincts are correct. Someone is definitely interested in Operation Nightfall, and they're not just looking for history lessons. The drive across town gave Robert time to think about how quickly his quiet life was unraveling. Just a few days ago, his biggest concern had been whether to plant tomatoes or peppers in his garden this year. Now he was carrying a concealed weapon and using counter-surveillance techniques to avoid being followed to a clandestine meeting. The office building was nondescript, the kind of place that housed small businesses and professional services. Robert parked in the back and waited, watching the mirrors and entrances for any signs of surveillance. Old habits were coming back quickly, as if the 45 years of civilian life had been just a brief interruption in his real career. Commander Sullivan arrived 20 minutes later, driving a different vehicle than he had used at the university. He was dressed in civilian clothes and moved with the controlled awareness of someone who was also checking for surveillance. They met at a side entrance, and Sullivan led him to a small office on the 3rd floor. Mr. Martinez, I'm going to be direct with you because we may not have much time. Sullivan began as soon as they were seated. The intelligence community has been tracking increased activity related to several Cold War operations, including Nightfall. Someone is actively seeking information about these missions and the people who carried them out. Robert felt his mouth go dry. Who? And why now? We believe it's connected to current geopolitical tensions in Eastern Europe. Some of the intelligence gathered during Operation Nightfall may be relevant to ongoing situations. There are people who want to know what was discovered back then, and they're willing to use any means necessary to get that information. But the mission ended 45 years ago. Most of the intelligence would be completely outdated by now. Sullivan shook his head. Not all intelligence ages out, Mr. Martinez. Some information becomes more valuable over time, especially information about networks, relationships, and operational methods. Your unit discovered things that are apparently still relevant today. Robert tried to remember specific details from missions he had tried to forget. Operation Nightfall had involved multiple assignments across Eastern Europe during the height of the Cold War. They had infiltrated government facilities, gathered intelligence on military capabilities, and documented political connections that extended far beyond what anyone suspected at the time. Commander, I was just a soldier following orders. I didn't know the bigger picture of what we were doing. Maybe not, but you were there. You saw things, heard conversations, made contacts. Even if you don't realize it, you possess information that someone considers valuable enough to risk exposure by coming after you. The reality of the situation was starting to sink in. Robert wasn't just an old man being watched by curious strangers. He was a target of people who had resources, training, and motivation to get what they wanted. People who wouldn't hesitate to use his family as leverage if necessary. What about the other members of my unit? Are they being targeted too? Sullivan's expression became grim. Mr. Martinez, as far as we can determine, you're the only surviving member of your original team. The words hit Robert like a physical blow. He had lost touch with his teammates after the operation ended, but he had always assumed they were out there somewhere, living quiet civilian lives like he was. Learning that he was the last one alive made him feel incredibly isolated and vulnerable. How did they die? Most from natural causes over the years, heart attacks, cancer, accidents. But 2 died under suspicious circumstances in the past 6 months. One in Phoenix was supposedly a robbery gone wrong, but nothing was taken from his house. Another in Detroit was reported as a car accident, but the crash investigator found evidence that his brake lines had been cut. Robert felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning in the office. So someone has been systematically tracking down the members of my unit. That's our working theory. Which means you're not just being watched, Mr. Martinez. You're being hunted. The commander reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. I'm going to show you some photographs. I need you to look at them carefully and tell me if you recognize anyone. The folder contained surveillance photos taken at various locations around the country. Some showed men in business suits. Others showed people who looked like tourists or ordinary citizens. But Robert's trained eye could see the subtle signs that these were professional operatives. The way they positioned themselves to watch exits, the casual clothing that concealed weapons, the alert expressions that never fully relaxed. In the third photograph, Robert's blood ran cold. The face was older and bore more scars, but he recognized the man immediately. It was someone from his past, but not from Operation Nightfall. This was someone from the other side, an enemy operative he had encountered during a mission in Prague in 1979. I know this one, Robert said, pointing to the photograph. His name is Viktor Petrov, at least that's what he called himself back then. He was Soviet intelligence, probably GRU. I ran into him during a mission and barely got out alive. Sullivan leaned forward intently. Are you certain? Absolutely. He has a distinctive scar above his left eyebrow from where I hit him with a vodka bottle during our encounter. I never forgot that face. Mr. Martinez, this photograph was taken 2 weeks ago at the Dallas airport. Viktor Petrov, if that's really his name, is in the United States, and based on the timing, he's probably here because of Operation Nightfall. Robert stared at the photograph, memories of that long-ago mission flooding back. Petrov had been hunting him then, and apparently, 45 years later, he was still hunting him. Some grudges, it seemed, never died. Commander, what do we do now? Sullivan closed the folder and looked directly at Robert. Now, Mr. Martinez, we prepare for war. The safe house was a modest ranch home in a quiet suburb outside San Antonio, the kind of place that looked completely ordinary from the outside but had been equipped with sophisticated security systems and communication equipment. Commander Sullivan had arranged for Robert to stay there while they developed a plan to deal with Viktor Petrov and whoever else was hunting the last survivor of Operation Nightfall. Robert found the transition back to an operational mindset both disturbing and oddly familiar. After 45 years of civilian life, he had thought that part of himself was buried forever. But as he checked the security systems and familiarized himself with the safe house procedures, he realized that once a covert operative, always a covert operative. The skills had been dormant, not dead. Commander Sullivan arrived each morning with updates on the investigation and intelligence about Petrov's activities. The Russian had been tracked to several locations around Texas, apparently gathering information about Robert's family, his routines, and his background. The surveillance was professional and thorough, indicating that this wasn't just one old man seeking revenge. Petrov was working with a team and had significant resources at his disposal. He knows about Michael, Sullivan reported on the third day. Petrov or one of his people was seen near your grandson's apartment complex. They're mapping out everyone connected to you, looking for pressure points they can use. Robert felt anger rising in his chest, the same protective fury he had felt during combat operations when civilians were threatened. Commander, we need to end this before my family gets hurt. What's the plan? Sullivan spread out a series of maps and photographs on the safe house table. We've been monitoring Petrov's communications, and we think we know what he wants. It's not just revenge, Mr. Martinez. He's after something specific from Operation Nightfall, something he thinks you know. What could I possibly know that would be worth this much trouble after all these years? Do you remember a mission in Prague in 1979? The one where you encountered Petrov? Robert nodded. It had been one of the most dangerous assignments of his career. We were extracting a defector who claimed to have information about Soviet nuclear capabilities. The mission went sideways when Petrov and his team showed up. We barely got out with the asset. The defector you extracted was Dr. Alexei Volkov, a Soviet nuclear scientist. What did he tell you during the extraction? Robert searched his memory, trying to recall details from a night that had been mostly chaos and adrenaline. He was terrified, kept talking about something called Project Winter. He said it wasn't just about weapons, but about something much more dangerous. I thought he was just rambling from fear. Sullivan's expression became very serious. Mr. Martinez, Dr. Volkov was debriefed after you brought him to safety. According to classified reports, Project Winter was a Soviet program to develop radiological weapons that could contaminate large areas for decades. The project was supposedly abandoned, but Volkov claimed he had critical research data before he defected. What does this have to do with Petrov hunting me down now? Recent intelligence indicates that someone is trying to restart Project Winter, probably for terrorist purposes rather than state-sponsored operations. They need Volkov's hidden research to make it work. The problem is Volkov died 10 years ago, and he never revealed where he hid the data. Robert felt pieces of a puzzle starting to come together in his mind. But Petrov thinks I might know something about where the data is hidden. Exactly. During that mission in Prague, you spent 6 hours alone with Volkov while waiting for extraction. Petrov believes Volkov told you something about the location of his research materials. Robert tried to remember more details from that terrifying night. He and Volkov had hidden in an abandoned building while Soviet forces searched the area. The scientist had been talking constantly, sometimes in English, sometimes in Russian, trying to process what he was doing and why. Most of it had seemed like nervous chatter, but now Robert wondered if there had been something more significant buried in all that rambling. I need to think about this, Robert said. There was so much happening that night, and I was focused on keeping us both alive. But maybe he did say something important. Over the next 2 days, Robert worked with a memory specialist that Sullivan brought to the safe house. Using techniques to help recover buried memories, Robert gradually began to piece together more details from that night in Prague. Slowly, fragments of conversations came back to him, including something Volkov had said about the place where the sun never sets. He kept repeating that phrase, Robert told Sullivan. At the time, I thought it was just a metaphor or something from Russian literature. But he was very specific about it. The place where the sun never sets, where the children play with metal toys. Sullivan immediately got on secure communications with intelligence analysts back in Washington. Within hours, they had a possible answer. During the Cold War, there had been a Soviet research facility in northern Siberia where the sun literally didn't set for months during the summer. The facility was codenamed Playground because it was surrounded by abandoned mining equipment that looked like giant toys from a distance. That has to be it, Sullivan said. Volkov hid his research data at the Siberian facility before he defected. He was giving you clues in case something happened to him before he could retrieve it. But why would Petrov think I could help him find this information? Even if I know where it's hidden, I can't exactly take a vacation to Siberia and dig it up. Sullivan showed Robert a satellite photograph of the abandoned facility. You don't need to go there, Mr. Martinez. The facility was shut down in 1985, and the site was sold to private investors. It's now owned by an American mining company that's been slowly dismantling the old Soviet structures. If Volkov hid something there, it could be recovered through legitimate channels. The pieces of Petrov's plan were becoming clear. He couldn't simply invade a former Soviet facility that was now owned by Americans, but he could force Robert to retrieve the information through legal means. Once Robert contacted the mining company and arranged for a search, Petrov could intercept whatever was found. So what's our move, Commander? Sullivan looked at the operational plans he had been developing. We're going to give Petrov exactly what he wants, but not the way he expects it. You're going to contact the mining company and arrange for a search of the facility. But instead of hiding from Petrov, we're going to let him know exactly what we're doing. Robert raised an eyebrow. That sounds like walking into a trap. It is a trap, but we're setting it, not walking into one. Petrov thinks he's hunting you, but we're going to turn this around and make him the target. The plan Sullivan outlined was complex, but elegant. Robert would openly contact the mining company and arrange for a search of the old Soviet facility, making sure that communications were conducted through channels Petrov could monitor. They would announce a specific date and location for the recovery of Volkov's research data, giving Petrov all the information he needed to plan an interception. What Petrov wouldn't know was that the entire operation was a setup. The real research data, if it existed at all, would be recovered quietly by U.S. intelligence operatives weeks before the announced date. The publicized operation would be designed to capture Petrov and his team when they attempted to steal information that wasn't actually there. The risk, Sullivan explained, is that Petrov might realize it's a trap and come after you directly instead of waiting for the operation. Robert thought about his grandson, his quiet life in San Antonio, and the secrets he had carried for 45 years. He was tired of running from the past, tired of looking over his shoulder, tired of worrying about what his old life might do to his new family. Commander, I've been running from ghosts for decades. It's time to put them to rest. 2 weeks later, Robert stood in the parking lot of an industrial facility outside Dallas, wearing a wire and surrounded by hidden federal agents. The mining company had agreed to cooperate with the operation, and their facility was being used as the meeting point for the supposedly legitimate recovery of Soviet research materials. Petrov arrived exactly on time, bringing 3 associates who moved with the fluid precision of professional operatives. From a distance, Robert could see that the Russian looked older and more weathered, but his eyes still held the same cold intelligence that had made him such a dangerous adversary decades ago. Mr. Martinez, Petrov said as he approached, his English carrying only a slight accent after years of living in the West. It has been a very long time. Not long enough, Robert replied, his hand instinctively moving closer to the concealed weapon he was carrying. Petrov smiled, but there was no warmth in it. You have something that belongs to me. Something that Dr. Volkov shared with you during your long conversation in Prague. I don't have anything that belongs to you. Volkov was a defector seeking freedom. Whatever he told me died with him. I think not. You see, Mr. Martinez, I have spent many years tracking down the members of your team. Each of them told me interesting stories before they died. Stories about how you were the one who spent the most time with Volkov, the one he trusted with his most important secrets. Robert felt his blood go cold as he realized what Petrov was saying. His teammates hadn't died in accidents or random crimes. They had been interrogated and murdered, probably after being tortured for information about Operation Nightfall and Dr. Volkov's research. You killed them. I gathered information from them, Petrov corrected. Their deaths were merely a natural consequence of their failure to cooperate fully. But you, Mr. Martinez, you are going to be much more helpful. Around the industrial facility, Robert could see Petrov's associates positioning themselves strategically. This wasn't going according to the plan Sullivan had laid out. Petrov wasn't here to steal research data. He was here to take Robert prisoner and extract information through interrogation and torture. Robert activated the emergency signal on his wire, alerting the federal agents that the situation was deteriorating. But he also realized that he might not live long enough for help to arrive. Petrov was positioning himself for a kidnapping operation, and Robert was the target. "Victor, you're making a mistake," Robert said, backing slowly toward a pile of industrial equipment that might provide cover. "This isn't 1979. You can't just disappear people in America without consequences." Petrov laughed. "Mr. Martinez, I have been disappearing people all over the world for 45 years. Age has not diminished my capabilities." The first shot came from one of Petrov's associates, aimed not to kill but to wound Robert and make him easier to capture. Robert dove behind a concrete barrier as federal agents emerged from their hidden positions around the facility. What had been planned as a quiet arrest operation suddenly erupted into a full-scale firefight. Robert drew his own weapon and returned fire, muscle memory from decades past guiding his movements. Around him, he could hear the sharp reports of professional gunfire as federal agents engaged Petrov's team. The industrial facility became a battleground, with concrete barriers and metal equipment providing cover for both sides. Petrov moved with the fluid grace of a man who had survived countless combat situations, working his way toward Robert's position while his associates kept the federal agents pinned down. Robert realized that despite all the planning and preparation, this was going to come down to a personal confrontation between two old soldiers who had been hunting each other for nearly half a century. "Martinez," Petrov called out during a lull in the gunfire. "This ends today, one way or another. You can tell me what I want to know, or I can take that information from your corpse." Robert checked his ammunition and prepared for what might be his final firefight. At 72 years old, he wasn't as fast or as strong as he had been during Operation Nightfall, but he was fighting for more than just his own life. He was fighting for his family's safety and for the memory of his murdered teammates. The final confrontation came when Petrov made his move, advancing on Robert's position while firing controlled bursts to keep him pinned down. Robert waited until the last possible moment, then rolled out from behind his cover and fired 3 quick shots at center mass. Petrov staggered but didn't fall, his own shot going wide as he fought to maintain his balance. For a moment, the two old adversaries stared at each other across the industrial yard, both wounded, both determined to finish what had started in Prague 4 decades earlier. "The research data," Petrov gasped, blood seeping through his jacket. "Where is it?" Robert looked at the man who had haunted his dreams for decades, who had murdered his friends, who had threatened his family. "Victor, there never was any research data." Volkov was a nuclear scientist, but he was also a paranoid schizophrenic. Project Winter existed only in his imagination. "You've killed innocent people chasing a delusion." Petrov's face went through a series of expressions: disbelief, rage, and, finally, a terrible understanding. He had spent 45 years pursuing something that had never existed, destroying lives in search of weapons that were never built. The Russian operative tried to raise his weapon for one final shot, but his strength failed him. He collapsed to the ground as federal agents secured the scene and called for medical assistance. Robert sat on a concrete block, feeling the weight of decades finally lifting from his shoulders. Commander Sullivan approached, checking him for injuries and coordinating with the medical team. "It's over," Sullivan said simply. Robert nodded, thinking about his grandson's graduation, about the quiet life he had built in San Antonio, about the secrets he had carried for so long. "Yes," he agreed. "It's finally over." 3 months later, Robert Martinez sat in his backyard garden, planting tomatoes and peppers while his grandson Michael helped him dig holes and water the seedlings. The young man had eventually learned some details about his grandfather's past, enough to understand why Robert had seemed so different after the graduation ceremony. Michael had asked many questions about Operation Nightfall and Robert's covert service, but he had also come to appreciate why his grandfather had kept those secrets for so many years. Some sacrifices were made in silence, some service went unrecognized, and some heroes never got medals or parades. Robert's phone rang, and he saw Commander Sullivan's number on the caller ID. They spoke occasionally now, sharing updates on intelligence matters and maintaining the friendship that had developed during those dangerous weeks when the past had caught up with the present. "How are you doing, Mr. Martinez?" "I'm doing well, Commander. Working in my garden, spending time with my family, living a quiet life. That's good to hear. I wanted to let you know that the final report on the Petrov operation has been filed. Officially, it's classified, but unofficially, I can tell you that some people at very high levels are aware of what you did and grateful for your service, both past and present. Robert looked at his grandson, who was carefully measuring the spacing between tomato plants, and felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in decades. Commander, sometimes the best recognition is just being able to live a normal life with the people you love. Yes, sir. I think you've earned that. As Robert ended the call and returned to his gardening, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him from a college graduation ceremony to a final confrontation with his past. He thought about the teammates he had lost, the secrets he had kept, and the family he had protected. The sun was setting over San Antonio, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Michael was telling him about his new job, his plans for the future, his dreams for the life he was building. Robert listened and smiled, knowing that the next generation would have the freedom to pursue their dreams because his generation had carried the burden of protecting them. In his garden, surrounded by the simple pleasures of civilian life, Robert Martinez finally felt like he could close the book on Operation Nightfall and all the shadows it had cast over his life. The mission was complete, the enemy was defeated, and the old soldier could finally rest.